Hi guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be discussing and learning what is the planned economic system, also known as the command economy. Now, before I proceed, I must tell you that planned economic system has been removed from the O-level and the IGCSE economic syllabus. By removing it from the syllabus, what I mean is that they will not test you explicitly on the planned or the command economy. However, in order to understand the mixed economic system, you have to first understand how the government operates. So it is mandatory for us that in order to have a better understanding of, mixed economic system, and also in order to have a better understanding that why do economies transition to mixed economies from market economies, we have to understand how the state or the government operates. That if this economy's whole key economic decisions were given in the hands of the state, how would they have done it? So it is important for us to understand this. However, you do not have to learn this in a lot of detail. Just a basic understanding of how things are running is enough, but this information will definitely help you for the topic of mixed economic system, which is in our syllabus. So guys, what is a planned economy, right? See, when we talk about a plan, see, first things first, what do we actually mean by a planned economy? So a planned economic system is a system where the government, makes all the important economic decisions. In other words, what we are saying is that markets don't decide anything here. In the market economic system, we were saying markets decide whether they are markets for whatever industries, whatever industries you're talking about. The entire economic system was a market-based economic system where things were based on demand and supply. Resource allocation was based on demand and supply for almost all the industries in that economic system. But in the planned economic system, markets don't decide anything here. But then who decides? Who's the boss? The government. The government decides everything, which means that the government decides what goods should be produced, how those goods should be produced, and for whom those goods should be produced. So basically, the entire economy is planned by the government from the top to the bottom. Now, who owns these resources? Like in a market economic system, these resources are owned by private individuals and firms, but who owns factors of production? Guys, in a planned economy, so we're talking about ownership now. So in a planned economy, the factors of production, that is the land, labor, capital, enterprise, are owned by the state and the government. Private ownership is either very, 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 very limited or sometimes not even allowed at all, right? Which means that most businesses belong to the public sector, right? So guys, things like factories, farms, power stations, railways, even airlines, all this would be owned all this would be usually owned and controlled by the state, not private individuals, not private firms, right? So in a planned economic system, how are decisions made then, right? Because that is the next question students usually ask us. Then how does the government actually manage all of this, right? Well, the thing is, the answer to this is that the government uses something called a central planning authority, right? The government uses something called the central planning authority, and this authority, which is a government's body, this authority sets production targets that, how much should be produced. But these production targets weren't set by the market. The market was producing based on, if the demand is going up, it was producing more. If demand is going down, it was producing less. So things weren't based on any production targets. But here, the central authority would set a 5 to 10 year plan, a 5-year plan, or a 10-year plan, or a 7-year plan based on this is the target, or we're going to be achieving for agriculture, or for this is a target that we're going to be achieving in the tertiary sector or the manufacturing sector or this in the IT sector, right? So it sets production target that how much should be produced by every industry. The government would decide the prices for every product in every industry, for every good that is going to be sold in the market. That is going to be sold in the economy, and the government is also going to decide the wages of the labor as well for all the industries, right? And then the government would allocate resources to different industries. Like we're going to be allocating this much land labor capital to this particular industry. We're going to be allocating this much land labor capital to this particular industry, and none of this is based on demand and supply, unlike in a market economic system, right? So the government would decide, the central authority would decide how much schools, how much hospitals, and how much factories should actually end up producing that year, or how much services they should provide that year. And according, based on that production target, the government would allocate resources to those industries, right? So there is no role of demand and supply in deciding prices and even output. So when you talk about, I mean, what's the role of the prices then? If there's no role of the prices in terms of resource allocation. So what is the prices? So now let's talk about prices, because this is where planned economies are very different from market economy. See, in a planned economy, prices are fixed. They are fixed by the government, right, or the central authorities. In a planned economy, prices are fixed by the government. They are not determined by market forces. So, the government would be like the basic goods like food, electricity, transport. Prices for these basic necessities or basic goods, which are technically very essential for the people's welfare, prices would be artificially be kept low. The government would make sure that it keeps the prices artificially low. So the price is not low because the demand is low. The price is low because they are essential and the government wants it to be low. Well, that's low. Consumers, ain't it, right? So prices here are not acting as some sort of signals to the firms or signals to the consumers on where to allocate and how much to allocate resources, but they're acting as social tools to make sure that everyone can afford essential goods, because the welfare is at stake. The welfare is at the forefront. The government doesn't really has profits as an objective. It has economic welfare as an objective, society's welfare as an objective, right? So the main aim of a planned economic system is a bit different, and in fact entirely different from a market-based economy. In fact, the disadvantages of a market-based economy, that is the market failure that you see in a market economic system or capitalistic economies, you will not find that in planned economies, which are more socialist economies, sort of, socialist economies or communism-based economies. So why would a government choose this sort of a system? Why does the government wants to keep a planned economic system? Because the main aim is to ensure basic needs are met for everyone, that you can see the first point on your screen. Number two, to reduce income inequality, because over there, see, in a market economic system, basic needs were met, but only for the rich, not for the poor. People who could afford the goods were only able to buy the goods. What about the people who cannot afford those goods? And that was causing income inequality as well. We saw that the rich will be able to buy cars, houses, they will be able to increase wealth, but what about the poor? So it was causing income inequality as well, and that's unfair, that's inequitable, right? So the aim of the planned economic system is to make sure that we have an economic system where we try to reduce income inequality, because a market-based economic system where things are allocated and resources are allocated based on the price mechanism, that creates income inequality, and that's again a very major disadvantage of a market-based economic system. And also this is another basically a market failure. Another aim of the planned economic system is to avoid unemployment. See, the thing was that in a market-based economic system, whenever demand fell or industries were making losses, they were forced to exit, because remember the carrot and the stick thing. So there was no survival. There was no chance for inefficient firms or loss-making firms to fit in. They can't really survive. But then if firms or industries close down in a market-based economic system, that would cause unemployment for a lot of people. But in a planned economic system, the government will not shut down its industry just because it's having losses. So the aim is to avoid unemployment, right? And also, in a market-based economic system, there would also be unemployment, because let's say if I have an employee who's working for me for like 20, 30 years, but now he just gets, older and he's unproductive, then I would just fire him because I don't need him anymore, because, maybe a younger employee could work twice as much as him in a lesser salary. So again, in a market economic system, that is why we were saying that you need to increase your value in a market economic system in order to gain higher wages. Because remember, in a market economic system, firms value the labor that is valuable. Firms value or firms are willing to put in resources and invest in those goods that are valued by consumers as well, right? But that's not how a planned economic system operates. So the government would want to avoid unemployment. And the government would also want to provide essential goods like healthcare and education to everyone, not just the poor, but to everyone. Because this has to do with equity, like fairness. That's the objective. Equity, equitable outcomes, right? Equitable outcomes for everyone. That's what you can write. So the focus here, guys, the focus here is technically social welfare, society's welfare, that you can call, not profit, right? And what are the advantages of such a, so if you were to ask me how does the government allocate resources, what, how, for whom to produce, simple answer is that the government creates these plans, production plans for the industries, and it also decides what prices will be set. And if once it sets the prices, they are set. It's not that, oh, the demand for potatoes went up, so let's increase the prices. No, the government will not do that, right? Because the price mechanism is not there. The government fixes the price, and that is the end of story. And prices for essential goods would be artificially kept low. But that's an equitable system. That's good. But then it has disadvantages as well. So first, let's see what the advantages are. Right? The advantages basically are that it creates, number one, it creates more equal distribution of income because everyone gets access to basic necessities. So the poverty levels are reduced, and you can say that living standards of the economy and the welfare of the economy would improve in that sense compared to a market-based economic system. Also, there's no profit motive, so goods are produced because people need them, not because firms want profit. So since profit is not the objective, so the government pay firms, because you only have the government firms or the public sector firms, because in a planned economic system you only have the public sector making key economic decisions. The private sector is not there to make these decisions, but in a market economic system the private sector makes key economic decisions. So for a planned economic system, there is no profit motive. So goods are produced because people need them, not because firms want profit. But in a market economic system, goods are produced because firms want profit. Only profitable goods would be produced which are most valued by consumers. Third, there's full employment, and full employment means that there's the government would make sure that everyone is employed, and so the government can create jobs for the people, and that's what full employment would be the objective of this economic system. But in a market economic system, that economic system itself the framework on which that market-based economic system is based has full employment as an objective. It would not want employment for everyone. It would want employment only for the best. Because if it wants employment for everyone, then there's no incentive to be efficient and to be productive and to improve skills. So full employment is in a planned economic system because, so the government would end up creating jobs for people even if the private sector, unlike the private sector, because the private sector in a market-based economic system wasn't creating jobs for everyone, only for those who are actually valued and who can bring something on the table. But that doesn't happen in a planned economic system. So this actually provides income security and social stability. So this is the advantage. Also, in a market economic system, we said that the markets do not provide public goods. But in a planned economic system, you'll see the markets providing public goods because the markets are owned and controlled and run and managed by the public sector. So the government is directly going to provide public goods, also merit goods as well. Although merit goods were being provided by the private sector in a market-based economy as well. But we said that merit goods are underprovided. They are underconsumed and they are underprovided as well. Obviously, if something is underconsumed and there is less demand for it, why would firms provide it? So they are underprovided as well because they are underconsumed as well. So, but then the thing is that the government would provide merit goods, up to the socially optimum level. Remember that in the market failure video, we discussed that merit goods are underprovided and underconsumed below the socially optimum level. But the government would make sure that it provides merit goods to an extent that society benefits the maximum and what is optimum for the society, at least in theory. So, and it would also provide public goods as well. And so healthcare, education, housing, transport, either the government would just provide it for free or it would provide them at very low subsidized rates so that, even the low income groups and the poor can afford it in order to ensure equitable access for everyone, right? So the good thing is that the government is providing public goods, and also the government is providing merit goods at low rates or free or subsidized rates up to the socially optimum level. Unlike, because in a market-based economic system, merit goods are underconsumed and underprovided below the socially optimum level. Now, that doesn't really means that just because it has advantages doesn't mean it has limitations. But just because something has limitation doesn't also mean that it's bad. So disadvantages, number one, the foremost is, see, no system is perfect. So one big problem is the lack of incentives in a planned economic system. Workers and managers don't feel motivated to work hard because profit is not, there's no profit incentive. So that would obviously mean that workers and managers and even the entrepreneurs won't really feel that much motivated to work harder. I mean, the entrepreneurs are the government itself. So the government would also not feel motivated to work harder because although it will work hard to an extent that it provides social security and stability and employment and equitable access to everyone, but then that's not enough, right? That's just the bare minimum. A market-based economic system does much more than that, right? Because it has the objective of profit and it works around incentives. And, incentives are the key to resource allocation in a market-based economic system. We already studied that. Another issue with planned economic system, the second disadvantage is inefficiency, because the government doesn't, you see, resources could be misallocated because resources are not allocated based on the price mechanism. Because in the market-based economic system, if demand was going up, prices started going up, and that signaled producers that they should produce more of this good. So they started producing more of that good. If demand went down, prices went down, there was less motive. So there was a signal and incentive to produce less, they produced less. Probably some just exited from the market and some just started producing less of this good and more of this good. So resources were being constantly reallocated out of declining markets into profitable markets, and that's why we say that there's efficient resource allocation. But the thing is that all of this is not happening in a planned economic system. In a planned economic system, you don't really have the price mechanism, and that causes inefficiency. I'll tell you why it causes inefficiency, because you see, the thing is that government may over allocate resources to those goods that have low demand and may under allocate resources to those goods which have high demand, because the government is not allocating based on the price mechanism, or the government is not allocating based on which has higher demand or lesser demand, but it is allocating to according to what it deems fit or it thinks is best for society's needs. But the point is that the governments may also suffer from inaccurate information, and they may suffer from poor information. Had this been the private sector, it would have allocated resources accordingly. And since government lacks accurate information especially about consumer preferences, it lacks also, it sort of lacks information about resource scarcity. And when I say that it lacks information about resource scarcity, what we mean is that it may not really know that which factor of production it should allocate where, right? It may not know that which factor of production has what value and what worth, and whether they should sort of allocate more skilled labor to this particular good or less skilled labor to this particular good. And they may end up allocating their factors of production, both land, labor, capital, and enterprise, to sort of those goods and industries and in those things which they shouldn't have, right? Because they suffer from accurate information, and resources may be poorly allocated, and or you can say the resources may be misallocated, right? And also, in a market, in a planned economic system, you'll see that you have a lot of shortages and surpluses, because let's say the government says that we need to produce 1,000 tons of agricultural goods this year, but the demand was only 7,000, so you'll end up with 3,000 tons of agricultural goods in surplus. Now, what should the government do about it? Nothing. I mean, it can't do anything. You don't have the price mechanism that automatically solves this. Or maybe the government said that we should allocate, let's say, this much amount of money to public transport or transport sector, and the government ended up investing in, let's say, 100 public buses, but the demand was of 500 public buses. So you have like a shortage now. So now what? If this was done by the private sector would have allocated and come up with 500 buses, transport buses for the people. So the shortages and surpluses persist, and hence in that sense inefficiency persists, and in that sense there's misallocation of resource happening. So planners, like it's written in your screens as well, that planners may underestimate or overestimate demand, and because of inaccurate information. And sort of point 2 and point 3 are some sort of a bit linked and connected. So some goods may either be unavailable totally, while others may be overproduced and you'll have a surplus. So that's how things are, in a planned economic system. And also, lastly, there's limited choice. I mean, people don't get many options of goods and services. Obviously, because there's no incentive for profits, and plus there's no competition as well. I mean, although the public sector firms might be competing, but they're not competing for profit. And since they're not competing for profit, this is not competition in true economic sense, because competition in true economic sense is when you're competing for customers and you're competing for workers and you're competing for profits. And so this may result in some sort of inefficiency and complacency, and firms wouldn't really want to come up and innovate and invest in research and development and to come up with, they would never, they would not want to innovate themselves because you don't have a profit motive. And also workers, majority of the workers would be underpaid and less paid, because the government is not going to pay some workers very high while some workers very low, because the government also doesn't really want wage inequality, because wage inequality would create income inequality in society. So, and government really doesn't want that. While you could argue that this is a fair system, but then for people, let's say for people like me, if I am a very highly educated, qualified, productive worker, then I would want a very high salary compared to the less of my compared to my other mates, right? So what we're saying is that you have limited consumer choice, and that really results in that reduces consumer welfare. And that's the thing, that it reduces consumer welfare, and consumers aren't really happy. And that is why this system, the planned economic system, also failed. In the 1970s, we saw that different countries had adopted a planned economic system. Former China and let's say China previously adopted this. Even the former USSR adopted this, but all of them failed, and that is why now economies have a mixed economic system. But do we really have some economies that are the former USSR was, but do we have a textbook example of an economy that is a planned economic system? You can give the example of North Korea. I mean, North Korea still is a planned economic system, just by the way. So the government controls over there. The government controls almost all economic activities in North Korea. Former USSR, I mean, we're talking about the former USSR, but if you want to give a current example, then you can give the example of North Korea. So the government would control farming, manufacturing, trade, everything over there, right? And again, guys, the common pattern in a planned economic system is that they would prioritize equality, control over resources, control over industries, and control over production and prices and wages as well. And social welfare would be the forefront objectives. But such a system, while it looks very much fair, equitable, it reduces income inequality and everyone seems a bit happy. But in terms of but the question is, are everyone happy? Because consumer welfare is quite low in terms of less choice and all. So they struggle with, such systems struggle with efficiency. They struggle with, incentives, and incentives are very important for efficiency. And they also struggle with consumer choice. And, such systems also struggle with bureaucracy. They struggle with inefficient management. They struggle with inefficient allocation of resources. And that is why few economies stick to extremes. Few economies are extreme market economies, and few economies are extreme planned economies, and now economies are somewhere in the middle, which is basically your mixed economic system, which is actually the topic of our next video. So that is all for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you all in the next video in the mixed economic system. Until then, take care.